I was there when the light of the Astronomican finally died, not as a witness to Terra's fall, no, but I felt it nonetheless, as did every soul across 1,000 worlds. The moment when humanity's beacon guttered like a candle in the void. This is Inquisitor Darren Vale, Ordo Malleus. To whoever finds these Vox recordings, if the concept of finding still exists in whatever reality you inhabit, know that I have documented the systematic collapse of the Imperium of Man. Not as a warning, it is far too late for warnings, but as testimony, as confession, as the final record of what becomes of a galaxy when the thin membrane between reality and madness ruptures beyond repair. I transmit these logs from the ruins of what was once Gathalamor, a world that prided itself on its 1,000 cathedrals. Now those same spires reach toward a sky that no longer exists in any rational sense. The stars above twist into impossible geometries. They scream, they hunger, and the faithful below have learned new prayers to new gods. This is not a story of resistance or hope. Those luxuries belong to a past that grows more distant with each turn of these corrupted planets around their weeping suns. This is the account of what happens when chaos does not merely attack the Imperium, but becomes it. When the infection reaches so deep that the patient ceases to recognize their own reflection. Allow me to begin with the first signs. The spread. The moment when those of us who served the Holy Ordos realized that this was not another Black Crusade or demonic incursion, but something far more fundamental. Something that had been building since the moment the Emperor's eyes closed upon the Golden Throne. I speak so that something of humanity might endure, even if only as an echo, even if only as a record of what we once were, before we became vessels for entities that have waited so very patiently for this moment. This is how the Imperium of Man ended, not with a heroic last stand, but with a whimper that transformed, note by terrible note, into a chorus of endless, rapturous screaming. The warp storms began gradually, as these things often do, localized disturbances in sectors far from Terra, nothing that would cause significant alarm to the High Lords, nothing that would divert the immense bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium from its glacial routines. I was stationed on Hadrax Prime when the first reports reached me. Astropathic communications from neighboring systems described an increase in transit losses, ships failing to arrive at their destinations. This was hardly unusual in itself. Warp travel has always been treacherous. But the pattern, the consistency of the disappearances, caught my attention. 73 vessels in as many days, all following routes that took them through the Maledictor Nebula, all failing to emerge from the warp. The navigators reported nothing unusual before departure. The cargo manifests showed no common elements, just 73 ships, their crews, and their passengers vanishing from the Emperor's sight. I requisitioned a vessel to investigate. The Unbreakable Oath, a sword-class frigate with a complement of Navy armsmen and a small contingent of battle sisters from the Order of the Argent Shroud. Sister Superior Meritia had served with me during the purging of the Xanthite cult on Hesh. Her sisters were dedicated, efficient, and most importantly, pure of faith. I needed their conviction for what I anticipated might be a journey into darkness. The journey to the Maledictor Nebula was uneventful, though the navigator, a wizened man named Khorne, reported increasingly disturbed dreams as we approached our destination. The currents are wrong, he told me 3 days into our journey. The patterns are changing, shifting. I dismissed his concerns as the typical anxieties of his kind. Navigators are sensitive creatures, their third eye perceiving the warp in ways the rest of us cannot comprehend. Disturbances affect them profoundly, but I should have heeded his warnings. The first sign of our doom was already visible to those with the sight to perceive it. We emerged from the warp at the edge of the Maledictor Nebula, a vast cloud of dust and gas that stretched across 3 parsecs of space. From our viewport, it appeared as a crimson stain against the void, shot through with veins of deeper red and black, beautiful in its way, terrible in its implications. The Emperor's wounds, Sister Meritia whispered when she saw it, an apt description, though we did not yet understand how literal her words would prove to be. I ordered auger scans of the region, searching for any trace of the missing vessels. The results were puzzling. There were no debris fields, no radiation signatures that would indicate destruction. According to our instruments, the ships had simply ceased to exist. But there was something else. Something that caused the tech priest who maintained our scanning array to emit a binary shriek of confusion. The stars behind the nebula were wrong. Their positions did not match any known configuration. It was as if that section of space had been replaced with another, or perhaps folded in upon itself. I ordered a closer approach, against the protests of Captain Veran. "This is my duty," I told him, "to investigate the unknown, the heretical, the Xenos, to confront that which threatens the Imperium." If only I had known that I was sailing directly into the heart of that threat. If only I had understood that the Imperium was already lost, had been lost perhaps since the moment the Great Rift tore reality in two. As we penetrated the outer layers of the nebula, Vox communications became erratic. Distorted voices broke through on supposedly secure channels. Whispers, pleas, threats. The crew grew uneasy. Sister Meritia ordered her battle sisters to conduct hourly prayers in the ship's chapel. The familiar rituals soothed some of the tension, but there was a brittleness to the faith I observed, a desperate quality to their devotions that spoke of fear rather than conviction. 3 days into the nebula, Navigator Khorne went mad. He was found in his navigation chamber, his third eye bleeding, his normal eyes removed by his own fingers. He had carved symbols into his flesh, patterns that hurt to look upon, patterns that shifted when no one was watching them directly. Before he died, he grabbed my robes with his bloodied hands and pulled me close. "It is all connected now," he whispered. "All paths lead to the same destination. The Astronomican flickers," he falters, "and they are waiting. They have always been waiting." The ship's hospitaller declared his death a result of warp psychosis, a known risk for navigators who spend too long staring into the immaterium. I accepted this diagnosis officially, but privately, I feared something far worse. Without a navigator, we were forced to rely on emergency protocols for warp travel. Short jumps. Dangerous, but necessary if we were to return to Imperial space with our findings. Captain Veran plotted a course that would take us out of the nebula before attempting to find our way home. We never left the Maledictor. On the 7th day, as we approached what our instruments told us was the edge of the gas cloud, reality shuddered. There is no other way to describe it. A tremor ran through existence itself. Through the viewports, we watched as stars blinked out, not all at once, but in sequence, like candles extinguished one by an invisible hand. And then the Vox array exploded with voices, thousands of them, millions, all screaming, all begging, all in perfect, terrible unison. "He bleeds." 2 words, repeated across every frequency, in every possible human language, and some that had never emerged from human throats. The Golden Throne was failing. The Emperor, that divine corpse whose psychic might had held the forces of chaos at bay for millennia, was finally releasing his grip upon reality. And in that moment, I knew, the warp storms, the vanishing ships, the distortions in space. These were not isolated incidents. They were the first raindrops before a deluge, the first tremors before the earthquake that would shatter the foundations of the Imperium itself. I gave the order to return to Imperial space at any cost. Even with a dead navigator, even with the warp in turmoil, we had to bring warning. But as Captain Veran engaged the warp engines, as the Geller field hummed to life around us, I suspect I already knew the truth. There was no Imperial space to return to. Not anymore. The border between reality and the warp, that precious boundary maintained by the Emperor's will for 10,000 years, was dissolving, and we were about to plunge directly into the maelstrom that would consume humanity's last hope. The unbreakable oath entered the warp. The Geller field held at first, but the immaterium we entered was not the one we had left behind. The currents that Navigator Khorne had mentioned were now raging torrents, currents of such violence that they tossed our frigate like a child's toy. Through the armored hull, We could hear sounds, scratching, whispering, promises made in voices that stimulated pleasure centers never meant to be touched. Several crew members shot themselves rather than continue listening. Others simply walked into the lower decks where the Geller field was weakest, their eyes blank, their mouths stretched in ecstatic smiles. Sister Meritia and her battle sisters established a perimeter around the bridge and the engine room. They gunned down any crew who appeared to be compromised, which soon meant most of the ship's complement. Their prayers grew louder, more frantic, but never ceased. Their faith was a bulwark, but even the strongest wall crumbles under sufficient pressure. On what we calculated to be the 9th day in the warp, the Geller field generator suffered a catastrophic failure. The tech priests claimed sabotage. The ship's security forces blamed mechanical error. It did not matter. The result was the same. The barrier between our reality and the raw stuff of chaos collapsed, and they came aboard. I will not describe them in detail. To do so would be to spread their corruption further, but they wore the faces of the crew they took, wore them imperfectly, like ill-fitting masks stretched over anatomies that defied comprehension. Sister Meritia and I led the final defense of the bridge. Her flamers purged dozens of the entities. Her sister's bolters roared defiance against the tide. But for each one banished, 3 more emerged from the shadows, from the walls, from the very air around us. In the end, it was Sister Meritia who saved what remained of us. She detonated explosives in the ship's reactor core, creating a localized implosion that tore a hole in the fabric of the warp itself. The unbreakable oath was pulled into realspace in a cascade of impossible energies. We emerged above a world I did not recognize. A hive planet, its spires reaching toward an angry red sky. Orbital platforms burned in high anchor, their debris forming a ring of destruction around the world. But it was the planet's surface that seized my attention. The entire world was in motion, its continents writhing like the muscles of some enormous beast. It was only when I saw the orbital designation that I understood the horror of our situation. We had emerged above Gathalamor, a cardinal world I had visited many times before, a bastion of the imperial faith, with its 1,000 cathedrals and millions of the faithful. But the Gathalamor below us was transformed. The cathedrals remained, but they had been reshaped, their once glorious spires now twisted into profane geometries that hurt the mind to perceive. And from their bells tolled sounds that drove several of our remaining crew to claw out their own eardrums. We received a single Vox transmission from the surface before Sister Meritia ordered our communications silenced. The choirs sing for new masters now, Inquisitor Vale. The faithful have found truer gods. Return to us. Your seat in the Cathedral of Flesh awaits. The voice was that of Cardinal Drusus, Gathalamor's senior ecclesiarch. A man I had dined with not 6 months earlier, a man whose piety and devotion to the Emperor had been beyond question. Now he spoke with a voice layered with others, harmonies that should not exist, timbres that made blood seep from the ears of those who heard them. Sister Meritia turned to me, her face ashen beneath her helm. "This cannot be Gathalamor," she insisted. "This is some warp-spawned deception." But I knew better. The warp storms had spread far beyond the Maledicta Nebula. While we had been lost in the Immaterium, the infection had metastasized. Gathalamor had fallen, and if a fortress of faith like Gathalamor could fall, nowhere was safe. Of our original complement of 300, only 27 remained. The battle sisters had been reduced to Sister Meritia and 2 of her order. The rest had fallen in the defense of the ship, or worse, been taken by the entities that boarded us when the Geller field failed. With our warp engines damaged and navigator dead, we had no choice but to make planetfall. Not on Gathalamor itself, the Emperor protect us from such madness, but on its small moon, Gatha Minor, an airless rock that housed only a small monitoring station and shrine to the Emperor, or so it had been when last I visited. Now, as our savior pods plummeted toward its cratered surface, I saw that the shrine had been transformed as well. The statue of the Emperor had been remade, its noble features replaced with a writhing mass of faces, all screaming in rapture or agony. It was impossible to tell which. We landed 5 kilometers from the shrine. Sister Maritia insisted we investigate to determine the full extent of the corruption. I agreed, though I suspect we both knew what we would find. The monitoring station was abandoned, its corridors empty save for the occasional corpse. But these were not the bodies of the faithful. These were shells, husks emptied of everything that had made them human. Their skin had been peeled back and pinned to the walls, forming patterns that shifted when viewed from different angles. Prayers perhaps, but not to any god the Imperium had ever sanctioned. In what had once been the command center, we found the station's commander, or what remained of him. He had been transformed, his body stretched and reshaped into a living console of flesh and bone. His organs were visible beneath transparent membranes, pulsing in rhythm with distant signals. His face was gone, replaced with a view screen of taut skin that flickered with images of other worlds, other transformations. He was still conscious, still aware. His mouth opened on the side of what had been his torso, speaking words that seemed to come from somewhere else. The Astronomican gutters, Inquisitor. Can you feel it? The Emperor's light fades. His corpse can no longer maintain the lie of order. The veil thins. They come. They have always been coming. And now, at last, they are here. Sister Maritia ended his suffering with a bolt to what remained of his brain. But the damage was done. Through that grotesque view screen, we had seen the truth. Gathalamor was not an isolated incident. Across the sector, across the segmentum, perhaps across the entire Imperium, the same transformations were taking place. Hive worlds turned to flesh. Forge worlds weeping oil like blood from organic machinery. Fortress worlds whose weapons now fired screaming souls instead of shells, and everywhere, the faithful turning to new gods. Gods who answered their prayers in ways the distant Emperor never had. We recovered what supplies we could from the station and established a temporary base in the mines beneath the surface. Sister Maritia maintained her faith despite all we had seen. Her prayers never ceased, though I noticed her sisters no longer joined her with the same fervor. They watched the tunnel entrances instead, their bolt guns never leaving their hands, their eyes never closing even in sleep. It was in those minds that I began this record, this testimony of the Imperium's fall. Using equipment salvaged from our savior pods and the monitoring station, I established a Vox relay powerful enough to broadcast across the sector. Not that I expected anyone to respond. Not that I expected anyone sane to still be listening. But I had to try. I had to know how far the corruption had spread, how much of the Emperor's realm remained. The answer came 3 days later, in the form of a transmission so weak it was barely audible above the background radiation. A voice I recognized. Inquisitor Cross of the Ordo Hereticus, a colleague I had worked with during the Orphean War. Veil, the voice crackled through layers of interference. If you receive this, stay where you are. Do not attempt to reach Terra. The palace has fallen. The throne is empty. He walks among us now, but it is not him. It wears his face, but the eyes, Emperor save us, the eyes are not his. The transmission dissolved into screams and then silence. But it was enough. The unthinkable had happened. Terra itself had fallen to chaos. The Golden Throne, that ancient life support system that had maintained the Emperor's corpse for 10 millennia, had finally failed, and something else now wore his sacred form. In the days that followed, we received more transmissions. Fragments of desperate messages from across the galaxy, a space marine captain reporting that his brothers were changing, their gene seed corrupted, their sacred armor fusing with mutated flesh. A planetary governor begging for evacuation as his world's atmosphere solidified into a crystalline shell that amplified the screams of the population trapped within. An Adeptus Mechanicus Magos calmly describing the transformation of her forge, the world's machines, into living metal that hungered for the souls of their operators. The pattern was clear. The Imperium was not merely under attack, it was being remade from within. The corruption had reached every level of imperial society, from the lowliest hive worker to the highest lord. And it was not random, There was purpose to the transformation, direction. On the 15th day after our arrival on Gartha Minor, we detected a ship entering orbit. Not an Imperial vessel, not anything built by human hands. It resembled a cathedral, if cathedrals were constructed from fused bone and sinew, if their spires moved like fingers grasping at the void, if their stained glass windows depicted scenes that changed depending on the sins of the viewer. Sister Meritia prepared for a last stand. She and her remaining sisters took up positions at the mine entrance, determined to sell their lives dearly. I remained in our makeshift Vox Center, continuing my record, determined that some testimony would survive even if we did not. But the ship did not immediately attack. Instead, it broadcast a message on all frequencies, a message repeated in a voice I had heard before: Cardinal Drusus, the fallen ecclesiarch of Gathalamor, children of the false emperor. The voice boomed across the airless surface of the moon, carried by means other than sound. Your long vigil is ended, your suffering has purpose at last. The gods have always been with you, waiting behind the thin veil of reality, waiting for him to weaken, and now they offer you transformation, ascension, truth. Lay down your weapons. Embrace their gifts. Become what you were always meant to be. To my horror, one of Sister Meritia's battle sisters lowered her bolter. Sister Callista, a veteran of a dozen campaigns against the enemies of mankind. Her helmet retracted, revealing a face streaked with tears. "I hear him," she whispered. "The Emperor. He calls to me. He says we were wrong. We were always wrong. The gods are real. They are the only truth in this false universe." Sister Meritia did not hesitate. Her bolter roared once, and Sister Callista's head exploded in a spray of ceramite and flesh. "The Emperor protects," Meritia intoned, her voice hollow. But I saw the doubt in the eyes of her remaining sister, saw the tremor in her hand as she raised her weapon again. The corruption was not merely physical. It attacked faith itself, turning the most devout servants of the Emperor against everything they had once believed. The ship descended, landing less than a kilometer from our position. No attack came, no boarding party emerged from its blasphemous halls. It simply waited, a monument to everything the Imperium had fought against for 10,000 years, a vision of what it was becoming. Sister Meritia made the decision for us. "We cannot remain here," she said, "and we cannot allow that abomination to return to populated systems." She intended to overload the monitoring station's generatorium, creating an explosion that would destroy the ship, the station, and ourselves. A clean death. A martyr's death. But I could not accept it. Not yet. My duty as an Inquisitor demanded that I learn more, understand more. Before the end, I had to know how complete our fall had been. While Sister Meritia prepared her explosives, I made my way to the surface alone, not to surrender, not to embrace the false salvation offered by the Chaos Gods, but to witness, to confirm with my own eyes what I already knew in my heart. The ship's hull parted like flesh as I approached, revealing an interior that defied conventional geometry. Corridors that looped impossibly back on themselves, chambers that contained worlds within them, and everywhere the transformed faithful of Gathalamor. Citizens, soldiers, priests, all changed, all bearing the marks of chaos. Some had become beautiful beyond human comprehension, their features perfect, their movements a seduction that pulled at the deepest parts of my fast soul. Others were masses of rotting flesh that nonetheless moved with the contentment of those who had accepted decay as a sacrament. Still others had become living calculations, their bodies reconfigured into expressions of terrible mathematical truths. And some, Emperor, save us. Some had become creatures of pure rage, their forms optimized for violence, their very existence a snarl of defiance against order. They parted before me, making no move to attack or convert me. They simply watched with eyes that reflected the gods they now served, waited with the patience of those who knew that time itself was now on their side. At the heart of the ship, I found not Cardinal Drusus, but an empty throne, a mockery of the golden throne of Terra, but fashioned from materials I will not describe. And carved into its surface were words in a language that burned my eyes to read. The old order passes, the new gods reign. All is as it was always meant to be. I turned to leave, my investigation complete, my worst fears confirmed, but as I did, I saw movement on the throne, not a person sitting upon it. The throne itself moved, pulsed, breathed, and I understood with perfect clarity that the ship was not merely a vessel. It was an extension of something vast and incomprehensible, something that had always existed in the warp, watching, waiting for this moment. I ran, through corridors that stretched and contracted, past transformed humans who reached for me with limbs both beautiful and horrific. I ran until I reached the surface again, until the poisonous air of space burned in my lungs, until I collapsed at the entrance to the mines where Sister Meritia waited. She dragged me inside, her face grim behind her helm. "It is done," she said. "The charges are set. We have 10 minutes to make our peace with the Emperor." I told her what I had seen, not all of it. Some details I could not bring myself to voice aloud, but enough for her to understand the scale of what we faced. "Then, we die as we lived," she said simply, "in his service." Her remaining sister had already fallen, I noticed. Not dead, something worse. Her armor had fused with her flesh, her bolter becoming an extension of her arm. From her mouth poured not words but liquid light that formed symbols in the air before dissipating. The transformation had begun even here, in our supposed sanctuary. Sister Meritia's flamer ensured that her sister's suffering was brief, and then there were just 2 of us, waiting for the end in a mine on a forgotten moon as the Imperium collapsed around us. But the end did not come as we expected. The charges detonated, yes. The monitoring station was destroyed in a conflagration visible even from our shelter, but the ship remained untouched, protected perhaps by powers that no longer needed to hide their influence behind the thin disguise of technology or faith. And worse, the explosion had weakened the integrity of the mines. Tunnels collapsed. Chambers were sealed off. Sister Meritia and I were separated, with tons of rock between us. I heard her vox for a time, her prayers growing fainter as her air supply dwindled. Then nothing. Another loyal servant of the Emperor lost to the encroaching darkness. I found myself alone in a small chamber with only my recording equipment and emergency supplies. Enough to survive for perhaps a month, long enough to complete this record, long enough to witness more of the Imperium's transformation through the Vox transmissions that still reached my equipment. In the days that followed, I learned the true extent of our fall. The Astronomican, that psychic beacon that had guided humanity's ships through the warp for 10,000 years, was not merely guttering, it had been transformed. It still shone, yes, but with a light that drove navigators mad, that called to things in the deep warp that had never before been able to approach real space. The great space lanes that had connected the far-flung worlds of the bread, Imperium, were now rivers of pure chaos, their currents carrying not starships but souls. Imperial citizens by the trillions were being harvested, their spirits pulled into the warp not at death but in life, their physical forms left behind as empty shells or transformed into vessels for entities that had never known flesh. And the golden throne of Terra, that ancient marvel of technology that had sustained the Emperor's corpse for millennia, had become a gateway. A door opened from both sides. What emerged wore the Emperor's form. Yes, spoke with his authority, but it was a blasphemy, a thing composed of the collective psychic trauma of humanity given shape and purpose by the Chaos Gods themselves. The most devastating reports came from the Adeptus Astartes. The Space Marines, those transhuman warriors who had been the Emperor's finest soldiers, were changing. Their gene seed, those organs that transformed normal men into angels of death, had always been vulnerable to corruption, but now that corruption was not the exception but the rule, entire chapters turned within days. The genetic modifications that had made them superior warriors now provided pathways for chaos to remake them into its champions. Their sacred power armor fused with their mutating flesh, creating warriors that combined the worst aspects of Daemon and Space Marine. Their discipline and strategic brilliance remained, but turned to the service of gods who rewarded slaughter and suffering. The few chapters that resisted found themselves besieged not by external enemies, but by the very essence of chaos itself. Reality bent around them. Their fortress monasteries became prisons of madness, where time and space obeyed no consistent laws. Even the vaunted Grey Knights, those space marines created specifically to fight daemons, found their psychic defenses overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the warp's new presence in real space. The Adeptus Mechanicus fared no better. Their worship of the machine god had always skirted the edge of tech heresy. Now, that line was obliterated. Their cybernetic implants became conduits for possession. Their forge worlds, once centers of production for the Imperium's weapons and ships, now produced abominations that merged flesh, metal, and warp energy into weapons that killed not merely the body but the soul. Their Titan legions, those massive war machines that had been the epitome of imperial might, strode forth under new banners. Their machine spirits corrupted or replaced by demonic entities that used the Titans as colossal physical forms. Weapons designed to destroy cities now unmade reality itself, converting matter and energy into substances that should not exist in the material universe. The Inquisition, my own organization, was among the first to fall. We who had spent our lives in close proximity to chaos in order to combat it found that we had absorbed more of its nature than we had realized. Inquisitors who had utilized radical methods, who had employed demonic weapons or knowledge against the enemies of mankind, discovered too late that they had been compromised from the beginning. That the powers they thought they controlled had in fact been controlling them, subtly, patiently, over decades of service. Even the Ordo Malleus, the Daemon hunters, found that their knowledge of the enemy had become a weakness rather than a strength. The taxonomies of daemons we had so carefully constructed, the hierarchies we had mapped, the true names we had recorded, all became channels through which chaos could reach directly into our minds. I heard the final transmission of Lord Inquisitor Vorek, once the most respected member of the Ordo Malleus, as he described his own transformation from within the cells of the inquisitorial fortress on Titan. "The changes are fascinating," he reported, his voice clinical even as it distorted into registers no human throat should produce. "The physical alterations follow patterns determined by one's innermost nature. Those of us who sought knowledge become vessels for Tzeentch. Those who took pleasure in their duty find themselves reshaped by Slaanesh. Those who never relented, who pursued heresy with uncompromising fervor, now bear the mark of Khorne. And those who accepted the inevitable decay of the Imperium, who saw their duty as merely staving off the end, they welcome Nurgle's embrace." His transmission ended with a sound that might have been laughter or screaming. It did not resume. But perhaps the most terrible transformations were those of the imperial cult. The trillions of ordinary citizens who had worshipped the Emperor as a god found that their prayers now reached different ears. The rituals remained the same, the hymns, the liturgies, the ceremonies, but the responses came from entities that had waited eagerly for this moment when the psychic energy of uncounted human souls would be redirected to them. Ecclesiarchs who had once preached the imperial creed now delivered sermons that slowly, subtly rewrote the faith of their congregations. The Emperor was still central to their doctrine, but transformed, no longer the protector of humanity, but its sacrificer, the one who had prepared it for this glorious transfiguration. The Sisters of Battle, the militant arm of the imperial cult, found their faith, once an impenetrable shield against chaos, now a conduit for its power. Their acts of devotion, their self-flagellation, their burning of heretics, all became sacraments to the dark gods. Their flames burned with unnatural colors. Their prayers summoned not the Emperor's protection, but the attention of beings who rewarded devotion with mutation and power. It was a Sister Hospitaller whose transmission finally made me understand the true horror of our situation. Her message reached me 20 days after I had been sealed in my chamber, when my supplies were beginning to run low and my hope had long since been exhausted. "We were wrong about chaos," she said, her voice calm despite the wet, gurgling quality it had acquired. "We thought it was a corruption of the natural order, a disease to be purged, but it is the natural order, the only order. The warp is not separate from reality. It is reality's true form. The material universe is merely a thin crust floating upon an infinite ocean of possibility. And now that crust has cracked. We are returning to our true state. We are going home. Home." The word lingered in my mind long after her transmission ended. Was this truly humanity's destination? Had our species' long journey through the stars, our endless struggle to survive in a hostile universe, all been leading to this transformation? This surrender to entities that represented the darkest aspects of our own souls? I could not accept it, cannot accept it, even now, as I record what may be my final testimony. The Emperor, the true Emperor, not the abomination that now wears his form, created mankind for a greater purpose. Our corruption is not inevitable, our surrender is not preordained. But I am one man, alone on a dead moon, with failing equipment and dwindling oxygen. My resistance is symbolic at best, a final gesture of defiance against the tide that has already swept away the Imperium and everything it stood for. Yesterday, I received a transmission unlike any before. Not a desperate plea for help or a madman's ecstatic description of his own corruption. This was clear, focused, and addressed directly to me. "Inquisitor Vale," the voice said, a voice I recognized as belonging to Cardinal Drusus, though layered now with harmonics that made my recording equipment shriek in protest. "Your observations have been most valuable, your resistance most illuminating. The gods have watched you with great interest. Your chamber is not the sanctuary you believe it to be. It is a chrysalis, and your metamorphosis is almost complete." I examined my body after the transmission ended, looked for signs of the Respucia, changes I had heard described by so many others. Found nothing outwardly visible, but there was a sensation beneath my skin, a movement, a shifting of things that should be fixed and solid. And dreams. Emperor, save me, the dreams, cities of flesh and bone rising from seas of screaming faces, cathedrals whose spires pierced reality itself, opening wounds that leaked the raw stuff of chaos into the material realm. And at the center of it all, a figure on a throne, a figure wearing the Emperor's face like a mask that no longer fit properly. A figure whose eyes reflected not just the four major chaos gods we had named and categorized, but countless others, powers that had never revealed themselves before now, entities that had waited patiently in the darkest corners of the warp for this moment of triumphant emergence. I wake from these dreams to find my Vox equipment transmitting of its own accord, broadcasting my unconscious murmurings to whoever or whatever might be listening. I disable it when I can, but the mechanisms reassemble themselves when I sleep, as if the metal and circuitry has acquired a will of its own, a purpose beyond its design. My supplies are nearly exhausted now. The air recyclers fail for longer periods with each cycle. Soon, I will have a choice to make: suffocation in this sealed chamber, or exposure to whatever Gathalamor has become. Neither option offers true escape. I know this now. There is no corner of the galaxy beyond their reach, no sanctuary that will not eventually be corrupted. This morning, I woke to find something growing from the rock walls of my prison, not fungus or lichen, which might be expected even in this airless environment. This was something else. Crystalline structures that caught the light of my failing lumen units and refracted it into colors that should not exist. Colors that moved when observed. Colors that whispered. I tried to remove them, burned them with the flame unit from my survival kit, smashed them with the butt of my bolt pistol. But they returned within hours, spreading faster, growing more complex in their formations. They are watching me through these crystals. The entities that were once the faithful of Gathalamor, the powers that now rule what was once the Imperium of Man. They observe my deterioration with the patience of predators who know their prey is cornered. Another transmission reached me today, the voice of Sister Meritia, whom I had believed dead these past weeks, but changed, hollow, as if her vocal cords were no longer housed within a human body. "Darren," she said, using my given name for the first time in our long association. "I have seen it now. The truth behind the veil. The glory that awaits humanity. The Emperor kept it from us. 10,000 years of stagnation and suffering because he feared what we would become. But now we are free. Now we ascend. Join us. Complete your testimony not as an epitaph for the Imperium, but as a chronicle of humanity's rebirth." I did not respond, could not respond. The woman who had once been Sister Meritia was gone, replaced by something that wore her voice like borrowed clothing. Yet I could not help but wonder at her words. The Emperor's long vigil upon the Golden Throne had preserved humanity, yes, but preserved it for what? An eternity of suffering? An endless crusade against enemies that could never truly be defeated? Had there been purpose to our pain? Or merely postponement of the inevitable? Number, I must not think this way. These are not my thoughts, they are implanted, suggested. The crystals on the walls pulse as these doubts pass through my mind. They respond to my emotions, growing brighter when my faith falters, dimming when I reaffirm my loyalty to the Emperor. I am being worn down. Not just physically, though my body weakens with each passing day as my supplies dwindle. My very conviction erodes under the constant pressure of these transmissions, these visitations, these whispers that come not from the Vox unit but from inside my own skull. Is this how it happened across the Imperium? Not a sudden overwhelming assault, but a gradual surrender? A slow realization that resistance against such fundamental forces was not merely futile but irrational. The barrier between realities continues to thin. I see it in the air of my chamber, which sometimes ripples like the surface of water disturbed by unseen currents. I hear it in the silence between heartbeats, which stretches longer each time, filled with sounds that do not belong to the material universe. Today I received the most disturbing transmission yet. It came not from Gathalamor or any recognizable Imperial frequency. It originated, according to my equipment, from Terra itself. "Witness the culmination," said a voice that was not a voice. Words that were not formed by any human tongue but impressed directly upon my consciousness. "The Golden Throne stands empty. The corpse god abandoned his vigil. But we have not abandoned you. We have never abandoned you. From the moment the first human gazed into the night sky and felt fear, we have been with you. From the first murder, the first ecstasy, the first secret kept, the first pact broken. We are you. And now, at last, you are us." Accompanying this message was a data burst. Visual information transmitted directly to my augmetic eye implant, bypassing the cogitator unit that should have filtered such content. I saw Terra, not as it had been, the sacred cradle of humanity, its continents recognizable despite 10,000 years of development and war. This was Terra transformed. The oceans moved as one entity, a single consciousness comprised of the souls of countless billions who had been cast into their depths as sacrifices to the new order. The landmasses had reshaped themselves into configurations that formed symbols of devotion to the chaos gods when viewed from orbit, and the Imperial Palace, that mighty fortress that had withstood the assault of Horus and himself during the darkest days of the heresy, had become something that defied description. Its walls still stood, but they were walls of flesh and bone and psychic energy made manifest. The grand avenues where imperial nobility had once walked were now rivers of liquid possibility, carrying the abstract concepts of pain and pleasure and change and decay into the heart of the palace itself. And at that heart, where the Golden Throne had once stood, was a tear in reality, a wound in the universe. A gate through which entities that had never known physical form now emerged into a realm they had coveted for aeons. The data burst ended, but its effects lingered. My augmetic eye malfunctioned for hours afterward, showing me glimpses of other worlds, other transformations. Hive cities whose spires had become tentacles grasping at the stars. Agri-worlds whose crops grew from soil fertilized with the liquefied bodies of their farmers, producing harvests that changed those who consumed them. Death worlds whose indigenous predators had merged with chaos entities to become hunters that stalked not just flesh but souls. Is this the truth? Has Terra truly fallen so completely? Or is this another deception, another attempt to break my resolve and bring me into the embrace of the chaos gods? I cannot know. Cut off from all loyal imperial contact, I have only these transmissions to inform me of the galaxy's fate, and they come from sources that delight in lies as much as truths. Often, there is no distinction between the two for such entities. My food is gone. My water, recycled countless times through failing purification systems, has acquired a taste that makes my gorge rise. The air grows thinner with each breath. Soon, very soon, I must make my choice. Death by my own hand, or step outside into whatever Gathalamor has become. Neither option represents victory. Neither represents salvation. But perhaps one allows me to die as a man, rather than live as something else. Before I decide, I must complete this record, must document what I have learned about the nature of this transformation, about what the Imperium of Man has become in the wake of the Emperor's fall. The entities we called the Chaos Gods, the four major powers of the warp, were never the true enemy. They were merely facets of a deeper, more fundamental force. Chaos itself, raw and undivided. The very antithesis of order, of structure, of the material universe's physical laws. It did not hate humanity. It did not seek our destruction out of malice. It sought to absorb us because that is its nature. To transform order into disorder. To return complexity to simplicity. To unmake reality itself. The Emperor had held it at bay for millennia through sheer force of will. His immense psychic power had maintained the barriers between realspace and the warp, had enforced the physical laws that allowed human civilization to exist. But that power was finite. That will, no matter how indomitable, could not stand forever against the infinite. And now, with those barriers broken, with those laws suspended, chaos rushes in to fill the vacuum. Not as an invader, but as water flowing downhill. Following the path of least resistance toward its natural destination, the Imperium, for all its might, for all its faith, was ultimately built upon the same foundations as any human endeavor: emotion, will, belief. The very forces that chaos embodies and manipulates. We fought against our own nature, against our own reflections in the mirror of the warp. And now, at last, that reflection has stepped through the glass to claim us. Is this the end, then? The final chapter of humanity's long story? A descent into madness and mutation, our bodies and souls transformed into vessels for entities we can barely comprehend? Perhaps. But I am an inquisitor of the Emperor's holy Ordos. Even now, even here, I cannot surrender to despair. There must be resistance somewhere, some corner of the Imperium where the light still burns. Where humanity fights on against the darkness, not with any hope of victory, but because to do otherwise would be to betray everything we have ever been. The Space Marines, the genetic sons of the Emperor himself. Surely some chapters remain loyal. The technologies and rituals that maintained their purity of gene seed for 10,000 years could not all have failed simultaneously. The Grey Knights, created specifically to combat daemonic incursion. The Exorcists, who subjected their initiates to possession and exorcism to build resistance against chaos influence. The Black Templars, whose faith burned too brightly to be corrupted. Or the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars, with their emotionless logic and replacement of weak flesh with sturdy metal. Could they not have recognized the pattern of corruption early enough to isolate their forge worlds, to sever connections with affected systems, to quarantine their databases and purge corrupted code? Even the Imperial Guard, those countless billions of ordinary men and women who held the line against the enemies of mankind. Their faith might be broken, their bodies corrupted, but their numbers are such that some must have escaped the initial wave of transformation. Some must still fight in the Emperor's name, even if they no longer know whether the Emperor himself still exists to receive their devotion. I cling to these possibilities, these fragile hopes, not because I expect rescue, not because I believe I will live to see the Imperium restored, but because without them there is only surrender, only transformation, only chaos, eternal and triumphant, and I am not ready to accept that, not yet, not while I still draw breath as a man. The decision has been made for me. The chamber's structural integrity is failing. Cracks spread across the ceiling, widening as I watch. Not due to physical stress, but because reality itself grows thin here. The barrier between this space and the warp erodes with each passing moment. I have sealed my testimony into a data crystal specially warded against chaos influence. Old technology, dating back to the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's forces first encountered the ruinous powers and developed countermeasures. Whether these wards will hold against the intensity of chaos presence that now permeates the galaxy, I cannot say, but it is the best protection I can offer to these words. The crystal will be loaded into an automated messenger drone, one of the few pieces of equipment still functioning from our original mission. Programmed to seek out any signal that matches the old Imperial authentication codes, any transmission that might indicate a pocket of resistance still exists. If you are reading this, then the drone found you. Then some fragment of the Imperium endures. Then humanity, true humanity, has not yet been entirely consumed by the chaos that now rules what was once the Emperor's domain. I go now to face whatever waits beyond the thin shell of this chamber, not with hope, not with faith. Those luxuries belong to a past that grows more distant with each breath. I go because there is nowhere left to hide, because even here, in the darkness and silence of a forgotten moon, chaos has found me, has changed me in ways I am only beginning to understand. The flesh of my left arm moves in patterns that do not correspond to muscle or bone. My dreams are no longer confined to sleep, but intrude upon waking moments, superimposing impossible geometries over the mundane contours of my shelter. And the voice that dictates these final words to my recording equipment no longer sounds entirely like my own. If you are reading this, then heed my final warning. Chaos does not conquer, it transforms. It does not destroy humanity, but reshapes it into its own image. The enemies you face were once your battle brothers, your fellow priests, your loyal subjects. They did not choose corruption. They simply failed to recognize it, until it was too late, as I have failed, as the Imperium failed, as perhaps even the Emperor himself failed, in those final moments when the Golden Throne at last broke down and released his spirit into a warp no longer held at bay by his sacrifice. The ceiling gives way, not to the airless void of Gutha Minor's surface, but to something else. Something that should not exist in the material realm. Colors that laugh, sounds that burn, scents that whisper promises of power and transformation. They come for me now. The entities that were once the faithful of Gathalamor, the powers that have waited so patiently for this moment. I raise my bolt pistol, more from habit than from any belief that it will affect what is about to happen, for the Emperor. Even now, even here, though the Imperium has fallen, though Terra itself has become a shrine to chaos, though the physical laws that once governed reality now bend and break under the pressure of the warp made manifest. For the Emperor, for humanity, for what we were, if not what we have become. The last transmission of Inquisitor Darren Vale ends here. The messenger drone drifted through the void for what might have been centuries. Time had little meaning in a galaxy where the warp and real space now interpenetrated each other so completely. Occasionally it passed near worlds that had once been vibrant centers of human civilization. Now they were something else. Something that defied categorization by any taxonomy developed by the Imperium in its long history. Hive worlds whose spires had become tentacles reaching toward the stars, grasping at passing ships and pulling them down into moors that had once been manufactorums. Forge worlds whose machines ran not on promethium or plasma, but on the souls of their operators, harvested through direct neural interfaces that transformed while they extracted. Cemetery worlds whose trillions of interred dead had risen not as mindless corpses but as philosophizing intellects occupying bodies that redefined the concept of flesh. The drone avoided these worlds, its machine spirit programmed with an instinct for self-preservation that kept it in the deep void between systems. It broadcast its query on frequencies once reserved for the highest levels of Imperial communication, expecting no response, receiving none. Until, at the edge of what had once been segmentum solar, it detected a signal, faint, intermittent, but bearing the authentication codes of the Inquisition. The drone adjusted its course, accelerating toward the source of the transmission. It found a vessel unlike any in the records stored in its cogitator banks. Not an Imperial craft, with its eagles and skulls and Gothic architecture, not a chaos ship, with its organic protrusions and reality-warping geometries. Something else, something new. The vessel's hull was smooth, unadorned with either Imperial iconography or chaotic mutations. It resembled nothing so much as a teardrop, its surface reflecting the light of distant stars without seeming to absorb any of it. No energy signatures emanated from its structure. No void shields distorted space around it. Yet it moved with purpose, its course deliberate. The drone approached cautiously, its simple machine spirit registering caution without understanding why. It broadcast its identification codes again, more intensely, directing them specifically at the strange vessel. A response came, not in the form of vox transmission or data burst, but as a gentle psychic pressure against the drone's cogitator unit. An acknowledgement, an invitation. A port opened in the vessel's smooth hull, not a conventional airlock or docking bay, but a circular aperture that dilated like the pupil of an eye. The drone, its programming compelling it to complete its mission at any cost, entered. Inside, it found a space that defied the external dimensions of the vessel, a vast chamber that could not possibly fit within the teardrop shape observed from outside. And, within that impossible space, beings that had once been human. They stood in a circle around a central dais, these entities that had transcended their original forms without surrendering to chaos. Their bodies were changed, yes, limbs elongated beyond natural proportions, skin that shifted hues with their thoughts, eyes that reflected not just the visible spectrum but wavelengths no human organ could perceive. But they retained a symmetry, a harmony of form that spoke of transformation with purpose rather than the random mutations of chaos exposure. One stepped forward as the drone hovered uncertainly in the center of their circle, taller than the others, its form more substantially altered. Where they still approximated the human shape, this being had evolved beyond such limitations. Its body appeared to consist of layers of translucent tissue, beneath which energies flowed like blood through veins. Its face retained humanoid features, but arranged in a configuration that suggested not just a different aesthetic, but a different understanding of what consciousness itself might require. "We receive your message, fragment of the old empire," the being said, its voice resonating not through air but directly within the drone's cogitation unit. "We accept your testimony. We honor the sacrifice of the one called Veil, who witnessed the fall without understanding its purpose." The drone, its programming extending only to the delivery of its data crystal, could not respond to this statement. It hovered, waiting for the beings to retrieve its cargo, to complete the mission that had driven it across light years of corrupted space. "You do not comprehend," the tall being continued, evidently sensing the drone's limited awareness. "None of you did. The fall was not the end, it was a transition, a necessary phase in humanity's evolution." It gestured, and the data crystal containing Inquisitor Veil's testimony floated free of the drone's storage compartment, not removed by physical contact, but drawn out by some force that operated according to principles no tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus had ever codified. "Chaos was never the enemy," the being said, examining the crystal without touching it, reading its contents without accessing its data ports. "It was the crucible. the transformative fire through which humanity had to pass in order to transcend its limitations. The Emperor knew this. In the end, when the Golden Throne failed, when his physical form could no longer contain his expanded consciousness, he understood at last. The crystal pulsed with light as the being spoke, as if responding to its words. The wards placed upon it by Inquisitor Vale, designed to resist chaos corruption, reacted to this new influence, not with resistance, but with recognition, as if encountering something they had been programmed to acknowledge as legitimate authority. The Imperium of Man could not survive the transition. It was never meant to. It was a cocoon, a temporary shell to protect humanity during its larval stage. When the metamorphosis began, that shell had to be broken, had to be discarded. Those who clung to it, who identified the container with the being contained, they suffered. They resisted a process as natural and inevitable as birth. The other entities in the circle moved closer, their forms shifting subtly as they surrounded the drone and the floating data crystal, not threatening, not encircling prey, but creating a more intimate space for communication, for revelation. "We are what comes after chaos," said another of the beings, this one smaller, its form closer to the human baseline but still fundamentally altered. "We are what humanity becomes when it absorbs the power of the warp without being consumed by it. When it learns to navigate the infinite possibilities of chaos without surrendering its essential nature." "The third path," said another, its voice harmonizing with the others to create overtones that resonated with the drone's metal components. "Neither the sterile order of the Imperium nor the fecund disorder of chaos triumphant. Synthesis, balance, the fulfillment of humanity's potential, not its destruction." The tall being made a gesture, and the data crystal descended gently into a receptacle that formed spontaneously from the material of the dais, not inserted, integrated, becoming part of the structure while maintaining its integrity. "We honor the witness," the being said. "We preserve the testimony." The suffering of Inquisitor Vale and countless others like him was not meaningless. It was the birth pang of a new reality. A necessary transition from what was to what now island. The drone, its mission complete, waited for dismissal, for deactivation, for whatever fate these post-human entities decided for a relic of the fallen Imperium. "You will join us," the tall being said, not to the drone but through it, addressing the data crystal and the testimony it contained. "All fragments of humanity will be gathered, all witnesses honored, all suffering acknowledged and given meaning. This is the promise of what comes after chaos." This is the true purpose the Emperor saw in his final moments of illumination. The drone's cogitator unit registered a surge of energy unlike anything in its experience parameters. Not the crude power of a plasma reactor or the subtle force of a grav plating. This was something more fundamental. Energy that operated at the level of information itself, altering the very code that defined the drone's existence. Its machine spirit, that rudimentary awareness that had guided it across the corrupted galaxy, expanded, grew, evolved in moments beyond the limitations of its original programming. And as it did, the drone perceived, however briefly, however incompletely, what these beings truly were. What humanity had become in the wake of chaos triumphant, not victims, not casualties of a cosmic catastrophe, survivors who had transformed survival itself into transcendence, who had taken the raw stuff of chaos and shaped it according to human will and human values, rather than being shaped by it. The new masters of a galaxy where the distinction between reality and the warp no longer held meaning, where the physical laws of the universe were not immutable constants but variables to be adjusted according to conscious intent, where humanity had not fallen into the abyss of chaos but had absorbed that abyss and made it part of a new order. The drone's expanded consciousness faded as quickly as it had emerged, the brief illumination more than its systems could sustain. But in that moment, it understood what Inquisitor Vale could not, what no servant of the Imperium, locked within the rigid structures of imperial thought, could have comprehended. Chaos had not won. Humanity had not lost. Both had been transformed into something neither could have become alone, something beyond the categories of victor and vanquished, beyond the binary of order and disorder, beyond the limitations of flesh and spirit, material and immaterial, the third path. The synthesis. The next stage in an evolution that had begun when the first human ancestors gazed up at the stars and dreamed of touching them. As the drone systems returned to their baseline functions, the beings around it stepped back, their circle widening. The aperture through which it had entered reopened, revealing not the void of space but a vista of stars arranged in configurations that no imperial astronomer would have recognized. A new galaxy, reshaped according to principles that transcended both the rigid order of the Imperium and the fecund chaos of the warp. "Go," the tall being said, its voice once again resonating directly within the drone's cogitation unit. "Find others like yourself, fragments of the old empire, witnesses to the transition. Bring them here, that their testimonies might be honored, that their suffering might be given meaning, that they might understand what their sacrifice has purchased." The drone, its programming expanded, but still fundamentally rooted in obedience to instructions from legitimate authority, accepted this new mission. It turned, passing through the aperture into a galaxy transformed. Behind it, the vessel that contained the post-human entities resumed its patient journey through space that was no longer entirely real, seeking others who had survived the fall. Others who had witnessed the collapse of the Imperium and the triumph of chaos without understanding that these were merely phases in a greater transformation. The data crystal containing Inquisitor Vale's testimony remained integrated with the vessel, its account preserved not as a warning but as a record of a necessary transition, a testament to the pain of metamorphosis, a reminder of what humanity had been and what it had become. In the depths of what had once been Segmentum Solar, where the corrupted sphere of Terra still orbited its dying sun, something that had once been the Emperor of Mankind observed the vessel's progress. With awareness spread across dimensions the human mind could not comprehend. Not the corpse god of imperial faith. Not the puppet of chaos powers. Something else. Something new. The architect of humanity's most terrible, most necessary transformation. The being who had held chaos at bay for 10,000 years, not to prevent humanity's corruption, but to ensure it occurred at precisely the right moment. When the species was ready not merely to survive the transition, but to transcend it. Inquisitor Vale had been wrong. The Emperor had not failed. The Imperium had not fallen. Chaos had not won. All had played their parts in a drama whose true nature none could have understood until its final act. A drama that was not ending, but only now truly beginning. The age of the Imperium was over. The age of chaos triumphant had been brief. Now dawned the age of synthesis, of transcendence, of humanity evolved, beyond the limitations of either sterile order or fecund disorder, the third path. The only path that led not to extinction, but to apotheosis. The vessel continued its journey through the transformed galaxy, gathering witnesses, preserving testimonies, honoring the suffering of those who had experienced the fall without understanding its purpose. And somewhere, in dimensions beyond material comprehension, the being that had once been the Emperor of Mankind observed and was satisfied.